Money reveals what time conceals, and silence speaks louder than celebration. That's what I whispered to myself as I blew out a single candle on the small store-bought cake in my quiet living room on my 80th birthday. No missed calls to explain. Away, no belated text messages, just the hollow echo of a house that had raised 3 successful children, all mysteriously busy on this milestone day. Yet 2 weeks later, when the quarterly trust fund statements were mailed, my phone rang incessantly. 3 separate calls within an hour, each child suddenly finding time in their schedule to check in on how I was doing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Funny how financial paperwork accomplished what 8 decades of motherhood couldn't, capturing their undivided attention. I didn't answer those calls. Not immediately. After raising them through hardships they've conveniently forgotten, building a business they've never fully appreciated, and creating wealth they've always expected to inherit, I'd finally reached my breaking point. The birthday they collectively ignored became the day I decided to rewrite not just my will, but the very foundation of our family's future. What happened next changed everything. Not just for me, but for my children and grandchildren too. Sometimes the most profound lessons about gratitude arrive wrapped in the most unexpected packages. And sometimes, at 80 years old, you discover that the greatest gift you can give your family isn't the inheritance they're counting on, but the wake-up call they never saw coming. My name is Eleanor Woodridge, and this is the story of how I transformed decades of silent disappointment into my most meaningful legacy. The silence of my 80th birthday celebration wasn't what I had imagined when I sent out the invitations 3 weeks earlier. A milestone birthday, 8 decades of life, seemed worthy of gathering my family together. I'd reserved the private room at the Gardenia, an elegant restaurant overlooking Harrison Lake where we'd celebrated countless family occasions before. I'd ordered a special cake, picked out a new dress in my favorite shade of periwinkle blue, even had my hair professionally styled for the first time in years. "We wouldn't miss it for the world, Mom," my eldest son Richard had assured me when I called to confirm. Richard, at 56, ran a successful architectural firm in the city, designed the kind of homes featured in magazines, and lived in one himself with his wife Stephanie and their college-age twins. "Of course we'll be there, Mother," Elizabeth had said, her voice carrying that slight edge of impatience it always held when speaking to me lately. At 53, Elizabeth had followed in her father's footsteps, becoming a surgeon at the same hospital, where Harold had practiced for 30 years before his death. She had married Marcus, a hospital administrator, and they had one daughter, Sophia, now in medical school herself. "Count us in, Mom. We'll drive up that morning." Michael, my youngest, at 48, had promised. Michael had taken his business degree and built a tech consulting company that allowed him and his wife Kristen to maintain homes in both the city and on the coast. Their 2 teenagers, Jacob and Lily, were the only grandchildren who still occasionally called me just to chat rather than when they needed something. I'd believed them all. Perhaps that was foolish at my age, after so many disappointments carefully hidden beneath polite excuses. But hope is the last thing to die, even in a heart that has weathered as many storms as mine. At 6:15, 15 minutes past our reservation time, I sent a text to all 3 children. "I'm at the table whenever you're ready. No rush." At 6:30, I called Richard's phone. It went straight to voicemail. I called Elizabeth next and got the same result. Michael's phone rang several times before disconnecting. By 7, I had finished my complimentary glass of champagne and was trying to hide my concern from the increasingly sympathetic waiter. "Would you like to order, Mrs. Woodridge, or wait a bit longer?" he asked, his expression carefully composed to mask the pity I could clearly read beneath. "Just a few more minutes," I replied, forcing a smile. "I'm sure they've just been delayed." While I waited, I absently scrolled through my social media feed, something I rarely did. That's when I saw it. A photo posted just 30 minutes earlier by Richard's wife, Stephanie. The caption read, "Surprise anniversary dinner with our favorite people. Family time. Celebration." The photo showed Richard, Elizabeth, and Michael, along with their spouses and children, gathered around a table at the Copper Grill, the trendy new restaurant across town. They were raising glasses in a toast, everyone dressed in their finest, my grandchildren included. My first thought was confusion. There was no anniversary I could recall that fell on this date. Then slowly, like ice water trickling down my spine, came understanding. They hadn't forgotten my birthday. They had chosen, collectively, to attend another gathering instead, and they hadn't even bothered to call. I put down my phone and stared at the flickering candle on the table. The waiter approached again, his expression now unmistakably pitying. "Perhaps I could pack up a meal for you to take home," he suggested gently. I shook my head. "Just the check, please." "We have a small cake prepared," he continued. It was meant to be a surprise. That's when I saw it being wheeled over, a beautiful cake with "Happy 80th Birthday, Eleanor" written in elegant script. The restaurant had prepared it based on Richard's instructions when he'd called to confirm the reservation. So they had remembered enough to order a cake, but not enough to actually attend. "Would you like us to box it up?" the waiter asked. "No," I said, gathering my purse. "Thank you, but no." I paid the bill, adding a generous tip to compensate for the empty table, and walked to my car with as much dignity as I could muster. I didn't cry until I was safely home, door locked behind me. Then I allowed myself exactly 15 minutes of tears before wiping my eyes and making a decision. The next morning, I called my attorney, the same one who had handled Harold's estate 12 years earlier. "Meredith," I said when she answered, "I need to make some changes to my will and trust documents. How soon can we meet?" 2 days later, I sat in Meredith's office, explaining exactly what I wanted to do with the estate I had quietly built over decades. By the time I left, the paperwork was being drawn up, and for the first time since my disastrous birthday dinner, I felt a sense of control returning. My journey to that moment, sitting in a lawyer's office at 80 years old, redesigning my children's future, began long before any of them were born. I came from humble beginnings, the daughter of immigrants who arrived in this country with little more than determination and work-worn hands. My father, a skilled carpenter, and my mother, who cleaned houses for wealthy families, instilled in me 2 principles that shaped my entire life. Education would open doors that remained closed to them, and true wealth wasn't measured by possessions, but by what you built to last beyond your lifetime. I took their lessons to heart, working my way through college during a time when women were still primarily expected to find husbands rather than careers. I studied business administration, graduated with honors, and caught the attention of a small manufacturing company looking for someone to modernize their accounting systems. That company, Westfield Tools, would become my life's work and the foundation of everything that followed. It was there I met Harold Woodridge, a young doctor who had invested in the company and occasionally attended board meetings. Harold was different from the other men I'd met, respectful of my intelligence, fascinated by my ideas rather than merely tolerating them. We married in 1962, a partnership of equals that raised eyebrows in our social circle but provided the perfect foundation for our family. When the owner of Westfield Tools decided to retire in 1970, Harold and I took a considerable risk, leveraging everything we had to buy the company. While Harold continued his medical practice, I transformed Westfield from a regional supplier into a national name in precision manufacturing. The timing was perfect. American manufacturing was booming, and our specialized tools found markets across multiple industries. Through recessions and economic upturns, 3 pregnancies and children's illnesses, triumphs and setbacks, I guided Westfield with a steady hand. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the time Richard, our oldest, entered high school, we had expanded to 3 facilities and employed over 200 people. When Elizabeth was ready for college, Westfield's annual revenue had crossed the 8-figure threshold. And when Michael graduated from business school, convinced he knew more about running companies than his old-fashioned mother, we were fielding acquisition offers from multinational corporations. I refused those offers repeatedly, much to Michael's frustration. "Mom, you could cash out, enjoy life a little," he'd argued. "Why keep working so hard?" He couldn't understand that Westfield wasn't just a business to me. It was my 4th child, nurtured from struggling infancy to robust maturity. Harold understood. In our 48 years of marriage, he never once suggested I step back or sell the company. "Eleanor builds things to last," he would tell our children when they complained about my long hours. "That's what makes her extraordinary." When Harold died 12 years ago, a sudden heart attack that occurred, ironically, while he was playing tennis to stay healthy, I lost more than my husband. I lost the one person who had never seen my dedication as a character flaw, who celebrated my drive rather than questioning it. The children, all adults with families of their own by then, rallied around me initially. Richard handled the funeral arrangements with architectural precision. Elizabeth monitored my health with clinical detachment. Michael offered financial advice I didn't need. Within 3 months, they had resumed their busy lives, checking in with decreasing frequency. I immersed myself in Westfield, expanding into new markets, modernizing our manufacturing processes. The company flourished, even as my personal life. Contracted to occasional family dinners, graduation ceremonies, and holiday gatherings where I increasingly felt like an obligation rather than a welcomed presence. 5 years after Harold's death, I finally decided it was time. I accepted an acquisition offer from Bryson International that exceeded even Michael's ambitious valuation. The deal included substantial stock options and a 5-year consulting contract that kept me engaged while transitioning leadership. By the time the contract ended on my 75th birthday, my net worth had quietly grown to just over $38 million. I established the Woodridge Family Trust with the majority of those assets. The trust was designed with 3 equal branches, one for each child's family line, with distributions structured to support education, entrepreneurship, and retirement security. I remained the sole trustee during my lifetime, with Meredith designated to succeed me upon my death. My children knew about the trust, of course. They received quarterly statements showing its growth and occasional distributions for their children's education or special projects. What they didn't know, what I had never explicitly told them, was that the trust represented only about 60% of my total assets. The remaining 40% was held in a separate foundation I had established in Harold's name, dedicated to providing scholarships for first-generation college students and supporting small business development in underserved communities. Had planned to announce this foundation at my 80th birthday dinner, to invite my children and grandchildren to join its board, to create a shared legacy that would extend beyond mere financial inheritance. I had imagined their surprise, perhaps even their pride, in discovering this dimension of their mother they had never fully seen. Instead, I sat alone at a restaurant table, staring at a melting cake while they celebrated an invented occasion across town. That night, as I drove home from the Gardenia, I realized something fundamental had broken in our family, something money couldn't fix but might help illuminate. The trust they took for granted had become an expectation rather than a gift, their birthright rather than my choice. The quarterly statements arrived with the regularity of changing seasons, noted but never truly appreciated. Perhaps, I thought as I parked in my driveway, it was time for a different kind of statement altogether, the morning after my disastrous birthday. I awoke early, a lifetime habit that even disappointment couldn't disrupt. The house was quiet, filled with the familiar creaks and sighs of a home that had sheltered a family through 50 years of triumphs and heartbreaks. I made coffee in the kitchen where I'd once prepared countless family meals, standing at the same countertop where 3 children had done homework, where Harold had mixed his famous Sunday morning pancake batter, where life had unfolded in ordinary moments now burnished by memory. I carried my cup to Harold's study, a room I'd gradually claimed as my own after his death, though I still thought of it as his. The mahogany desk that had been our 20th anniversary gift to each other gleamed in the early light. The bookshelves still held his medical texts alongside my business references, a tangible representation of our partnership. I settled into the leather chair and opened the bottom drawer, removing a leather portfolio that hadn't been disturbed in months. Inside were documents my children had never seen, the complete financial records of the Woodridge empire I had quietly built over decades. What my children knew, what I had shared openly, was only the surface. They understood that Westfield Tools had been acquired for a substantial sum. They were aware of the family trust and its generous provisions for them and their children. What they didn't know was the full extent of my financial acumen and the true scope of our family's wealth. While Harold had been respected as a surgeon, I had been the true financial architect of our family's prosperity. From that first risky acquisition of Westfield, I had methodically expanded our investments, diversifying into real estate during the 1980s recession when properties could be acquired at bargain prices, shifting into technology stocks before the boom of the 1990s, and wisely moving assets to more conservative positions before the 2008 financial crisis. The Woodridge family trust, substantial as it was, represented only a portion of our total assets. The rest was distributed across a constellation of investments, properties, and financial instruments that I managed with quiet efficiency. I had never flaunted our wealth or used it to cultivate social status. Harold and I had agreed early in our marriage that material excess created entitled children, so we maintained a comfortable but not lavish lifestyle even as our net worth grew exponentially. I spread the documents across the desk, statements from accounts my children knew nothing about, the foundation charter Harold and I had drafted before his death, property deeds for holdings in 3 states. Together they told the story of a woman who had not merely been lucky in business, but strategically brilliant throughout her life. The truth was that I could have retired decades ago. I continued working because I loved building something lasting, not because we needed the income. When I finally sold Westfield, it was because the time felt right for succession, not because I needed the capital. The trust my children assumed was the entirety of their inheritance amounted to perhaps 60% of my total assets. The remainder, nearly $25 million, was carefully structured through separate entities, including the Harold Woodridge Memorial Foundation, which supported medical scholarships and rural clinic development, causes that had been dear to my husband's heart. I had planned to invite my children to join the foundation's board after my 80th birthday, to engage them in philanthropy that would extend our family's legacy beyond material wealth. I had imagined them discovering this dimension of their parents' values, perhaps even feeling pride in being part of something larger than themselves. Now, I wondered if they were capable of appreciating such a legacy. Their absence at my birthday celebration had revealed something troubling about their characters. Not just thoughtlessness, but a fundamental misalignment with the values Harold and I had tried to instill. I gathered the documents back into their folder and reached for my phone. My financial advisor, James Chen, answered on the second ring despite the early hour. "Eleanor," he said warmly, "I was planning to call you today. Happy belated birthday." At least someone had remembered. "Thank you, James. I need to meet with you as soon as possible. Today, if you can arrange it." There must have been something in my voice that conveyed urgency because he didn't question the request. "I can rearrange my morning. Would 10:30 work?" "Perfectly. And James, I'll need comprehensive statements of all holdings, including the offshore accounts and the Wyoming Property Trust. A brief pause. Everything? May I ask what you're planning, Eleanor? A significant restructuring, I replied. 1. That's long overdue. After hanging up, I turned to my computer and logged into my banking portal. Another aspect of my life that might surprise my children. Unlike many of my contemporaries who relied on younger family members for technology assistance, I had embraced digital tools early and efficiently. I maintained all my financial accounts myself, monitored investments daily, and could navigate complex banking platforms with ease. I reviewed the recent activity in the family trust accounts, noting the educational disbursements for my grandchildren's tuition, the quarterly income distributions to my children, and the administrative expenses. Everything appeared in perfect order, as I knew it would. I had always been meticulous about financial management, a trait that had served Westfield well during economic downturns and had preserved our family's security through market volatility. What struck me now, looking at these orderly records, was how my children had come to expect this stability without appreciating its source. The quarterly distributions arrived in their accounts with the predictability of sunrise, acknowledged with the same casual acceptance. The educational trusts for my grandchildren ensured they would graduate without student debt, a fact mentioned, with pride to friends, but rarely with gratitude to me. Had I enabled this entitlement through my own reticence? By managing everything quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention to the skill and effort involved, had I made it too easy for them to take it all for granted? I closed the computer and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Harold and I had spent countless evening hours planning our future, discussing our children's development, and eventually, in those final years, contemplating our legacy. "What would you do, Harold?" I whispered to the empty room. "Would you accept their excuses? Would you continue as if nothing had changed?" In the silence that followed, I felt a certainty that surprised me. Harold wouldn't have raged or condemned, but neither would he have allowed such behavior to pass without consequence. He had believed, as I did, that character was revealed in choices, and that true parenting never really ended. My children had made their choice. Now it was time for me to make mine, not in anger or retribution, but with clear-eyed purpose and the same strategic thinking that had built Westfield Tools from a struggling local manufacturer into an industry leader. They had forgotten that before I was their mother, I was Eleanor Woodridge, a businesswoman whose competitors had learned, sometimes painfully, never to underestimate. Perhaps it was time my own children learned the same lesson. 3 days after my fateful birthday, I was tending to my garden, a lifelong passion that had only deepened in my later years. The June morning was perfect, warm sunshine filtering through the maple trees I'd planted when we first bought this house. My roses needed deadheading, the hydrangeas required extra water during the early summer heat, and the vegetable patch Harold had built decades ago still produced tomatoes and cucumbers that tasted far better than anything from the grocery store. Gardening had always been my meditation, my way of processing life's complexities while nurturing something beautiful. As I knelt beside a particularly vibrant peony bush, I heard the distinctive sound of tires on gravel, the unmistakable purr of Michael's luxury SUV pulling into my driveway. I continued with my gardening, not looking up even as I heard car doors slam and the murmur of voices, Michael's baritone and the higher pitch of his wife Kristen. They had brought reinforcements, it seemed. "Mom?" Michael called, rounding the corner of the house to the backyard. "There you are! We've been calling you for days." I snipped another faded bloom before finally acknowledging him. "I've been busy." Michael stood at the edge of the garden, impeccably dressed as always in casual designer clothes that probably cost more than most people's formal wear. At 48, he had Harold's height and build, but my dark eyes and determined expression. Unlike Richard's diplomatic approach or Elizabeth's clinical detachment, Michael had always been direct, sometimes to the point of bluntness. "Mom, what's going on?" "You're not answering calls. Elizabeth says you practically threw her out yesterday. And now there's this weird note on the trust statements about structural changes. Kristen hung back slightly, her expression suggesting she'd cautioned Michael against this confrontational approach. Of my 3 children's spouses, I'd always felt she understood me best. "Good morning to you too, Michael," I said calmly, rising from my kneeling position with more grace than most people my age could manage. "And hello, Kristen. It's nice to see you." "Hi, Eleanor," Kristen said warmly, stepping forward to kiss my cheek. "The garden looks beautiful." "Thank you. Would you both like some iced tea? I made fresh this morning." Michael made an impatient gesture. "Mom, we didn't come for tea. We came because you're not answering your phone and there's clearly something going on." I removed my gardening gloves methodically, taking my time. "I didn't answer because I had nothing to say. About missing your birthday? Look, we all feel terrible about that. It was poor coordination, bad planning on our part. But it wasn't intentional. Wasn't it?" I asked mildly, gathering my gardening tools. "Because poor coordination might explain one of you being absent. All 3 of you, along with your spouses and children, gathering at another restaurant, across town for a celebration that could have been held any other day? That seems quite intentional." Michael had the good sense to look uncomfortable. "It wasn't like that. Stephanie and Richard's anniversary is in September," I finished for him. "This is June." "It was a pre-celebration," he said weakly, then seemed to realize how ridiculous it sounded. "Okay, it was stupid scheduling. We should have moved their thing to accommodate your birthday. I get that, and I'm sorry." I studied my youngest son, this man who had built a successful business but still sometimes showed flashes of the impatient boy who wanted everything on his terms. "You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about scheduling conflicts. It's about choices and what they reveal about priorities." "Mom," he began. But Kristen touched his arm gently. "Eleanor," she said, her voice soft but direct. "I think what Michael is trying to say is that we all made a terrible mistake. One we deeply regret. We're here to apologize and to understand how we can make things right." I felt a flicker of appreciation for her sincerity. "Thank you, Kristen. I accept your apology." "And mine?" Michael asked, spreading his hands. "When you offer one that isn't wrapped in excuses, I'll consider it." His face reddened slightly. "That's not fair. I just drove an hour to come see you." "After ignoring my birthday and then discovering there might be changes to the trust fund," I pointed out. "Interesting timing." "Are you seriously suggesting I only came because of money?" His voice rose, indignantly. "After everything I've done for you since Dad died?" I felt a flash of genuine anger for the first time. "Everything you've done for me? Please enlighten me." "What exactly have you done for me, Michael, that wasn't actually for your own convenience or conscience?" The question hung in the air between us. Michael opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly struggling to formulate an answer that wouldn't sound self-serving. Kristen stepped into the uncomfortable silence. "Eleanor, we're all upset right now. Maybe we should take some time to cool down, then talk again later." "A reasonable suggestion," I agreed, my voice steadier than I felt. "In the meantime, I have preparations to make." "Preparations for what?" Michael asked, his eyes narrowing. "I'm traveling. Taking an extended trip to see places I've always wanted to visit." "Traveling? Where? For how long?" The questions came rapidly, an echo of Elizabeth's reaction. "I haven't finalized all the details yet, but I'll be starting with Alaska in 2 weeks." Michael exchanged a quick glance with Kristen before responding. "Mom, is this really the right time for a big trip? With Sophia's white coat ceremony coming up and the kids' summer activities?" "I wasn't aware my presence was considered essential at family events," I interrupted. Given recent evidence to the contrary, his expression shifted from concern to irritation. "So this is punishment. You're going to miss important events because we missed your birthday. This isn't punishment, Michael. It's prioritization. I'm 80 years old. I've spent decades arranging my life around everyone else's schedules and milestones. Now I'm choosing to experience what remains of my life on my own terms. And the trust fund changes? He asked bluntly. Are those also about prioritization? There it was, the real concern beneath the surface apologies and expressions of regret. The trust fund is my responsibility as trustee, I replied evenly. Any changes I make will be with careful consideration for the long-term welfare of all beneficiaries. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting today. I turned toward the house. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have calls to make regarding my trip. Mom, Michael called after me, his voice holding a note of desperation I rarely heard from him. Don't do anything drastic because you're upset. We can fix this. Just talk to us first. I paused at the back door, looking over my shoulder at my youngest child. This man who had grown so confident in his professional life, but still sometimes seemed like the little boy who believed any problem could be solved with enough charm and persistence. I've spent 80 years talking, Michael, I said quietly. Perhaps it's time for me to act instead. My meeting with James Chen that morning solidified my resolve. As my longtime financial advisor, James knew my portfolio intimately, but he seemed surprised by the scope of the changes I proposed. You understand the implications of these adjustments, Eleanor? He asked, reviewing the notes he'd taken during our 2-hour discussion. His normally unflappable demeanor showed signs of concern. This represents a fundamental restructuring of your estate plan. I understand completely, I assured him, my voice steadier than it had been in days. I'm not acting impulsively, if that's your concern. He smiled slightly. I've known you for 30 years. Impulsive has never been in your vocabulary. But these changes are significant, particularly the trust modifications. The trust has always been within my power to adjust as trustee, I reminded him. The terms were deliberately flexible to accommodate changing family circumstances. Of course, he acknowledged, but redirecting nearly 40% of the assets to your foundation and reconfiguring the distribution parameters for the remainder, your children will have questions. I'm counting on it, I said with a small smile of my own. The current structure no longer serves its intended purpose. It's become an expectation rather than an incentive for the values Harold and I wanted to encourage. James nodded slowly. I've seen it before. The second generation sees wealth as an entitlement rather than a responsibility. He hesitated before continuing. They'll likely view this as punishment for missing your birthday. I considered this, gazing out his office window at the city skyline, a view that included the Westfield building, now bearing the Bryson International logo, but still recognizable to me as the company I'd built. Their perception is beyond my control, I said finally. What matters is creating a structure that genuinely benefits them in the ways that matter most, not just financially, but in character and purpose. And the Alaska trip? Is that part of this recalibration? That's simpler, I admitted. At 80, I'm acutely aware that time is my scarcest resource. I've postponed too many personal dreams. No more. James closed his portfolio. I'll have the paperwork drawn up according to your specifications. The trust amendments will require legal review through Meredith's office, of course. Of course. I'm meeting with her tomorrow. I'd appreciate if you could coordinate with her team. As I prepared to leave, James asked a final question. When do you plan to inform your children of these changes? They'll receive formal notification after the amendments are filed, but I suspect they'll be asking questions much sooner. The quarterly statements were distributed yesterday, with a notation about upcoming structural adjustments requiring a family meeting. He raised an eyebrow. That will certainly get their attention. That was the intention. The remainder of that day passed in a flurry of productive activity. I contacted a travel agency specializing in luxury tours for seniors, booking not just the Alaska cruise, but a comprehensive itinerary extending through the fall, New Zealand, Australia, and a December holiday in the Maldives. I called my doctor to arrange the necessary vaccinations and travel health consultation. I researched luggage designed for older travelers, ordered specialized walking shoes, and began assembling lists of books I wanted to read during my journeys. Each preparation reinforced my sense of reclaimed autonomy. For decades, I had oriented my calendar around my children's schedules, their children's milestones, the rhythm of family gatherings where my presence was expected, but, I now realized, not necessarily valued. This new itinerary recognized only my own interests, my own timeline, my own priorities. By evening, I felt more energized than I had in years. I prepared a simple dinner and carried it out to the garden patio Harold and I had designed together, a space where we'd spent countless summer evenings discussing our days, our dreams, our children's futures. The setting sun cast a golden glow across the carefully tended flower beds and the small koi pond that had been Harold's 60th birthday gift to me. "I think you'd approve," I said aloud to the empty chair beside me. Not of their behavior, but of my response to it. Speaking to Harold's memory had become a habit in the years since his death, a private ritual that brought comfort. "Remember what you always told Richard when he was learning to sail? You can't control the wind, but you can adjust your sails." My phone rang, interrupting this moment of reflection. Michael's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, not yet ready for the confrontation I knew was coming. Within minutes, Elizabeth called, then Richard. Their coordinated effort might have amused me under different circumstances. Clearly, they'd noticed the trust statement notation and were comparing notes. I silenced my phone and returned to my dinner, enjoying the chorus of evening birds and the gentle splash of the koi in their pond. The confrontations would come soon enough. This evening belonged to me, to my memories, to the future I was purposefully redesigning. The next morning, I met with Meredith at her downtown office, arriving early to avoid any possibility of encountering my children, who I suspected might attempt to intercept me there once they realized I wasn't answering their calls. Meredith welcomed me with the efficient warmth that had characterized our professional relationship for decades. Now in her 60s, she had handled every major legal matter for our family since Harold and I had first engaged her firm to structure Westfield's expansion in the 1980s. She knew our family history, understood our values, and had helped design the original trust that my children now took for granted. "James sent over the proposed amendments," she said, gesturing to the documents on her desk. "I've reviewed them, and while they represent a significant restructuring, they're well within your rights as trustee and primary grantor." "And legally sound?" I confirmed. "Absolutely. The original trust instrument specifically reserved your right to adjust allocations and distribution parameters. The only limitation is that you cannot completely disinherit any of the named beneficiaries without their documented misconduct, which you're not proposing to do." "No," I agreed. "This isn't about disinheritance. It's about aligning incentives with values." Meredith studied me thoughtfully. "May I speak frankly, Eleanor? I'd expect nothing less. These changes will be interpreted as punitive, regardless of your intention. Your children will feel threatened, possibly betrayed. Are you prepared for that reaction?" I considered her question carefully. "I'm not naive about how they'll initially perceive this, but I have to believe that once they understand the underlying purpose, they'll recognize it as an opportunity rather than a punishment. And if they don't, then I've misjudged their character more profoundly than I realized," I said quietly. "And that would be a grief far greater than their absence at a birthday dinner." Meredith nodded, seemingly satisfied with my response. "When would you like to schedule the family meeting?" The amendments will be ready for filing by next week, but I recommend discussing them with your children beforehand. After I return from Alaska, I decided, mid-July would be appropriate. That gives them time to wonder and worry, perhaps reassess some assumptions before we meet. And in the meantime? I have a cruise to prepare for and a life to reclaim. As I left Meredith's office, I felt the weight of decades lifting from my shoulders. The decisions had been made, the course charted. Whatever storms might follow, I would face them with the same determined resilience that had built Westfield Tools from a struggling local manufacturer into an industry leader. Eleanor Woodridge was finally putting herself first, and it felt like freedom. The days following my meetings with James and Meredith passed in a curious blend of tension and liberation. My phone continued to accumulate missed calls and increasingly urgent text messages from all three children, occasionally interspersed with attempts from my grandchildren, clearly prompted by their parents. "Grandma, please call Dad. He's really worried about you," read a message from my grandson Jacob, Michael's normally cheerful 16-year-old. "Grandmother, are you okay? Mom says you're not answering anyone's calls. We're concerned," wrote Sophia, Elizabeth's daughter, her text reflecting the formal tone she'd adopted since entering medical school. The manipulation was transparent, if somewhat effective in tugging at my heartstrings. I hadn't intended to worry my grandchildren, who were innocent bystanders in this family drama. After considering how to respond, I sent each of them a brief message. "I'm perfectly fine, dear one. Just busy preparing for my Alaska cruise. I'll send pictures from the glaciers. Love you." I deliberately avoided addressing their parents' concerns or explaining my silence. Let the adults handle their anxiety directly, rather than recruiting children as emotional messengers. Meanwhile, I continued my travel preparations with methodical enthusiasm. I purchased a new digital camera with enhanced stabilization features designed for older hands. I ordered specialized cold weather clothing for Alaska and lightweight, breathable attire for the Australian leg of my journey. I arranged for my neighbor's college-age daughter Amanda to house-sit during my absence, caring for the garden and the koi pond that had been Harold's pride and joy. Through it all, I felt Harold's presence more vividly than I had in years, not as a ghost or supernatural visitation, but in memories that surfaced with startling clarity. While sorting through my closet to decide what to pack, I found the jade earrings he had brought back from a medical conference in Hong Kong for our 30th anniversary. Holding them triggered a cascade of recollections. His boyish smile when he presented them, his large surgeon's hands fumbling with the delicate clasp as he helped me put them on, the way he had whispered, "They match your eyes, Ellie." No one had called me Ellie in the 12 years since his death. I had been Mom to my children, Eleanor to friends and colleagues, grandmother to Sophia, grandma to the other grandchildren. Hearing that nickname again, if only in memory, reconnected me to a part of myself that had been dormant too long. The woman who had been Harold's partner and equal, not just his widow or their mother. I tucked the earrings into my travel jewelry case, determined to wear them in Alaska. Harold would have approved of this journey, this reclamation of self. He had always encouraged my independence, even when it raised eyebrows among his more traditional colleagues in the 1960s and 70s. "My wife runs a manufacturing company," he would say with unmistakable pride when introduced at medical conventions. "She builds the tools that build America." He never diminished my accomplishments to protect his ego, never expected me to play the silent, supportive doctor's wife that was the norm in their social circle. The memory of his unwavering support strengthened my resolve as I continued preparing for both my travels and the more complicated journey of restructuring our family dynamics. On the 5th day of my self-imposed communication blackout, the inevitable confrontation arrived, not via phone calls or texts, but in the form of all three of my children appearing simultaneously on my doorstep at 7:30 in the evening. Their coordinated ambush suggested a strategy session had occurred, something that might have pleased me under different circumstances. At least they were working together. Through the front window, I could see them standing in a loose semicircle. Richard, in the center, always the designated spokesman. Elizabeth to his right, her posture rigid with barely contained impatience. Michael pacing slightly on the left, never comfortable with stillness. All were dressed casually but carefully, their expressions set in various combinations of concern and determination. I considered not answering, but that would only postpone the inevitable and potentially escalate their worry to involving authorities. Instead, I straightened my shoulders, smoothed my hair, and opened the door with a composed expression. "This is a surprise," I said mildly, though it was anything but. "Mom," Richard began, his architect's voice calibrated for diplomacy, "we've been trying to reach you for days. We were worried." "As you can see, I'm perfectly fine," I replied, making no move to invite them in. Elizabeth stepped forward, medical authority radiating from her stance. "Mother, this behavior is concerning. Sudden withdrawal from family contact, impulsive travel plans, cryptic messages about trust fund changes. These could be signs of cognitive issues that should be evaluated." I had anticipated this tactic, the suggestion that any assertion of independence must indicate mental decline rather than legitimate choice. It was a common strategy used against aging parents who refused to comply with their children's expectations. "How interesting," I observed, allowing a hint of amusement to color my tone. "3 missed calls from each of you constitutes concerning behavior. But all 3 of you missing my 80th birthday dinner doesn't warrant similar medical interpretation." Michael flushed. "Mom, we've all apologized for that. It was a terrible mistake. But this silent treatment and these sudden changes, it's not like you." "Perhaps you don't know me as well as you think you do," I suggested. "Or perhaps I'm finally allowing myself to be exactly who I am, without accommodating everyone else's expectations." They exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them that excluded me. A familiar pattern I had noticed with increasing frequency in recent years. Richard cleared his throat, clearly moving to their prepared agenda. "Mom, we'd like to come in and talk. About everything. The birthday, the trust changes, your travel plans. As a family." I considered their request. Standing on the porch having this discussion seemed petty, despite my reluctance to make them too comfortable. "Very well," I said, stepping back to allow them entry. "But I have a call scheduled in 45 minutes that I won't be rescheduling." They filed into the living room, taking their usual positions, Richard and Elizabeth on the sofa, Michael in the armchair by the window. I chose Harold's old leather recliner, a subtle reminder of his absent presence in this family conclave. "Would anyone like tea?" I offered, maintaining the formality that had always characterized our more difficult conversations. "Mom, can we skip the tea ritual and just talk directly?" Michael asked, his characteristic impatience breaking through. "What's going on with the trust?" The statement mentioned structural changes and a mandatory family meeting in July. So that was the primary concern that had finally driven them to coordinate this visit. Not worry about my well-being or regret about the birthday, but anxiety about their inheritance. "The trust is being restructured," I confirmed, seeing no reason to be evasive now that we had reached the heart of the matter. "The changes will be fully explained at the meeting Meredith is arranging for mid-July, after I return from Alaska." "But what kind of changes?" Richard pressed. "The trust has been set up the same way for decades. Why change it now?" "Because it's no longer serving its intended purpose," I replied simply. "Which was what exactly?" Elizabeth asked, her clinical detachment slipping to reveal genuine confusion. The question surprised me. Had I never explicitly told them? Or had they simply never listened? The trust was established to provide security for future generations while encouraging the values your father and I believed in: education, service, entrepreneurship, and family connection, I explained. It was never intended as a blank check or an entitlement. Are you saying we've failed to live up to your values? Richard asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. That we've somehow proven ourselves unworthy of our inheritance? I considered his question carefully, aware that my answer would shape the trajectory of this conversation, and perhaps our family's future. I'm saying that the current structure has created dependency rather than independence, expectation rather than appreciation. The changes aim to correct that imbalance. By punishing us for missing your birthday, Michael interjected, unable to maintain the united front they had apparently planned. If I wanted punishment, Michael, I could simply disinherit all of you, I pointed out calmly. The trust gives me that authority in cases of documented misconduct, but that's not my intention. Then what is your intention? Elizabeth demanded, her professional composure cracking further. To make us worry? To teach us some kind of lesson? To realign incentives with values, I said, using the same phrase I had shared with Meredith. To ensure that what Harold and I built serves as a foundation for growth rather than a substitute for it. That sounds like consultant speak, Michael scoffed. What does it actually mean in practical terms? I folded my hands in my lap, maintaining the calm center I had cultivated through decades of business negotiations. It means that approximately 40% of the current trust assets will be redirected to the Harold Woodridge Memorial Foundation, which focuses on medical education and rural healthcare access, causes your father cared deeply about. Their shocked expressions might have been comical under different circumstances. 3 successful adults suddenly confronted with the prospect of receiving millions less than they had counted on. 40%? Richard repeated, his architect's precision requiring exact figures even in moments of distress. That's nearly $15 million. $15,600,000 at current valuation, I confirmed. The remaining funds will be restructured with modified distribution parameters. Modified how? Elizabeth asked, her physician's analytical mind clearly calculating implications. The details will be covered at the family meeting, I said, unwilling to delve into specifics that might generate more arguments than understanding. But the core concept is simple. Future distributions will be tied to activities and choices that demonstrate commitment to family, community, and personal growth. Michael gave a short, incredulous laugh. You're making our inheritance conditional? Like we're children who need to earn an allowance? Not conditional, I corrected. Aligned. The trust will continue to provide substantial financial security, but it will no longer function as passive income without active engagement. This is because we missed your birthday, Elizabeth stated flatly, not a question, but an accusation. This is because that missed birthday illuminated a problem that has been developing for years, I countered. It was a symptom, not the disease. Richard, always the mediator, leaned forward with his most reasonable expression. Mom, we understand you were hurt. We should have prioritized your celebration. But making drastic changes to financial arrangements that all of us have built our lives around, that affects our children's futures, our retirement plans. Your children's educational trusts remain untouched, I interrupted. College, graduate, school, professional training, all fully funded as originally planned. As for your retirement, each of you earns well into 6 figures annually. If you've constructed lifestyles that require trust distributions to sustain, perhaps that's precisely the problem I'm addressing. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken recriminations and dawning realization. My children had built lives that depended on inheritance they had not yet received, counting chickens before they hatched, as my own mother would have said. Michael recovered first, shifting to a strategy I recognized from his business negotiations, the appeal to fairness and precedent. Dad would never have agreed to this. He believed in unconditional support for family. It was a calculated attempt to leverage Harold's memory against me, and it struck a nerve despite my preparation. "Don't presume to tell me what Harold would have wanted," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "We discussed these matters extensively throughout our marriage, and especially after you all were established in your careers. The original trust structure reflected our shared values at that time. The modifications reflect how circumstances have changed." "What circumstances?" Elizabeth challenged. "Our success? The fact that we have busy lives and missed one dinner?" "The circumstances of being taken for granted," I replied, the hurt I had been containing finally coloring my words. "Of becoming an afterthought in the lives I helped build. Of watching my children model for my grandchildren that family obligations are dispensable when inconvenient." Richard winced visibly. "That's not fair, Mom. We've always respected—" "Respect isn't something you declare, Richard. It's something you demonstrate through choices and actions." I glanced at my watch, genuinely surprised to see that our 45 minutes had nearly elapsed. "I have that call in a few minutes. We should wrap up." "Wrap up?" Michael exploded, jumping to his feet. "You drop a bombshell about redirecting $15 million, hint at making us jump through hoops for what remains, and then want to wrap up because you have a call?" "Yes," I said simply, rising from my chair with the dignified posture that had served me through countless challenging board meetings. "My time has value too, Michael. Another fact that seems to have escaped your attention." Elizabeth stood as well, her clinical detachment completely abandoned. "This isn't over, Mother. If you're experiencing some kind of late-life crisis that's affecting your judgment, we have options. Legal options." The threat hung in the air, crude but predictable. I had anticipated this possibility and discussed it thoroughly with Meredith. But I should mention that I underwent a complete cognitive assessment with geriatric specialists last month. Standard procedure for someone my age making significant financial decisions. The results confirm what I already knew. I'm completely competent to manage my affairs and modify trusts I established. This revelation clearly caught them off guard. I had indeed completed such an assessment, not because I doubted my faculties, but because I had anticipated this exact challenge from my children. "You planned this," Richard said slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. "You've been setting this up for weeks." "I've been considering these changes for years," I corrected. "Your collective absence on my 80th birthday simply confirmed their necessity." My phone chimed discreetly, signaling the upcoming call I had mentioned. Not a fabrication, but a scheduled conversation with my travel agent about final arrangements for Alaska. "I need to take this call," I said, moving toward the door in clear dismissal. "We'll continue this discussion at the family meeting in July. Meredith will send the official notification with all details." "And until then?" Michael demanded. "We're just supposed to wonder what you're doing with our inheritance?" The possessive pronoun, our inheritance, crystallized exactly why these changes were necessary. "It's not your inheritance yet, Michael," I reminded him gently. "It's my life's work, and I have both the right and the responsibility to ensure it creates the legacy Harold and I envisioned." I opened the front door, signaling an end to the conversation that left no room for further argument. As they filed past me, expressions ranging from shock to anger to calculation, I felt not the satisfaction of winning a confrontation, but the heavy certainty of having taken necessary action that would cause pain before healing could begin. When they had gone, I closed the door and leaned against it briefly, allowing myself a moment of acknowledgement for the magnitude of what I had set in motion. Then I straightened, checked my appearance in the hallway mirror, and went to take the call about my upcoming adventure, the first of many steps toward reclaiming the life that had gradually slipped away while I wasn't paying attention. 2 weeks later, I stood on the deck of the Silver Mist cruise ship, watching the Seattle skyline recede as we began our journey toward the inside passage of Alaska. The morning air carried a brisk freshness that felt symbolic, the cleansing start of a new chapter. My stateroom was elegant, but not ostentatious, with a private veranda perfectly situated for viewing the spectacular scenery to come. I had upgraded from my original booking, deciding that at 80, I deserved the small luxuries that would make solo travel more comfortable. The aftermath of the confrontation with my children had unfolded largely as I expected. Initially, there had been a flurry of increasingly urgent communications. Calls, texts, even a formal letter from an attorney Richard had consulted, requesting documentation about the trust modifications in the spirit of family transparency. Meredith had handled that inquiry with professional precision, providing exactly what was legally required and nothing more. Then, as my departure date approached, their strategy shifted. First came the guilt-laden messages reminding me of family, events I would miss. Next, the thinly veiled suggestions that travel at my age carried unnecessary risks. Finally, when those tactics failed, a sudden flurry of solicitous attention. Offers to drive me to the airport, suggestions for travel accessories I might need, questions about my itinerary framed as concern for my safety. I maintained polite, but firm boundaries throughout, accepting none of the offered assistance while expressing appropriate gratitude for their concern. "I've arranged everything necessary," became my standard response. "I'll be in touch when I can." Now, as the ship's horn sounded our departure and Seattle gradually diminished on the horizon, I felt the weight of family expectations falling away with each nautical mile. For the first time in decades, my schedule was dictated solely by my interests, my energy, my curiosity. The sensation was simultaneously exhilarating and disorienting. Freedom often is when you've grown accustomed to constraints. First time. "To Alaska?" asked a voice beside me. I turned to find a tall, silver-haired gentleman about my age, impeccably dressed in what I recognized as high-quality casual wear designed for travelers who appreciate both comfort and style. "Yes," I admitted, "though I've wanted to see it for at least 40 years. He smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of eyes that suggested considerable time spent outdoors. "Worth the wait, I promise you. I'm Robert Harrington." He extended his hand. "Third trip to Alaska, but first time solo." "Eleanor Woodridge," I replied, shaking his hand. "Also traveling solo." "Ah, then perhaps you'll join me for dinner?" The maitre d' mentioned he's arranging tables for solo travelers who prefer company for meals. I hesitated briefly, my natural reserve competing with the recognition that this journey was about embracing new experiences. "That would be lovely, thank you." As we continued chatting, I learned that Robert was a retired geology professor from California, a widower of 5 years whose passion for Earth's natural formations had taken him to every continent. Throughout our conversation, I found myself engaging in a way I hadn't in social situations for years, present, interested, unburdened by mental calculations about family schedules or obligations. The ship made its way north along the coast, and I settled into the rhythm of cruise life. With surprising ease, my days acquired a pleasant pattern, morning coffee on my veranda watching the mist rise from forested shores, educational presentations about the wildlife and geology we would encounter, afternoon tea with books from the ship's well-stocked library, an evening spent at a table of interesting companions ranging from retired professors like Robert to a former ballet dancer from New York, all of us embarking on solo adventures for our various reasons. I sent brief, cheerful updates to my grandchildren, as promised, carefully avoiding any communications that might be interpreted as invitations for my children to insert themselves into my experience. To Jacob, I sent photos of breaching humpback whales spotted from our ship. For Sophia, pictures of the ship's medical facility where I'd befriended the chief physician who offered fascinating insights into maritime medicine. To the others, glimpses of glaciers and fjords, harbor seals basking on ice floes, and eagles, soaring against impossibly blue skies. A week into the journey, we reached Glacier Bay National Park. I stood on deck wrapped in layers against the chill, watching in awe as massive walls of ancient ice towered before us, periodically calving, with thunderous cracks to send blue-white chunks crashing into the sea. The raw power and primordial beauty silenced even the most talkative passengers, creating a collective moment of reverence. In that silence, surrounded by wilderness that had existed long before human concerns and would endure long after, I experienced a profound sense of perspective. My family drama, which had consumed so much emotional energy, suddenly seemed small against the backdrop of these ageless formations. Not unimportant, family never is, but perhaps less all-encompassing than I had allowed it to become. That evening, as I prepared for dinner, I caught sight of myself in the stateroom mirror and paused in surprise. The woman reflected there looked noticeably different from the one who had embarked in Seattle just days earlier. My posture was more relaxed, yet somehow more dignified, my expression more open, my eyes brighter with genuine interest rather than carefully maintained composure. Even my movements seemed to have acquired a new fluidity, as if physical tension had been gradually releasing with each day away from familiar patterns. I fastened Harold's jade earrings, touched the simple gold wedding band I still wore on a chain around my neck, and whispered to his memory, "You were right, my love. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't staying, it's leaving." The final week of my Alaskan journey brought unexpected weather, gloriously clear days that our expedition leader described as remarkably rare for the region. We cruised through misty fjords with no mist at all, sunlight illuminating towering cliffs and waterfalls in crystalline clarity. In Sitka, we walked through a temperate rainforest beneath blue skies, spotting bald eagles in such abundance that even veteran travelers expressed amazement. "You've brought good fortune to our voyage, Eleanor," Robert commented one evening as our dining companions discussed the exceptional conditions. "Perhaps you should consider a second career as a weather charm." I laughed, enjoying the easy camaraderie that had developed among our table. If only I could have bottled this luck for all those rainy school picnics and outdoor graduations through the years. On our penultimate day, as the ship docked in Ketchikan, I received an unexpected email from Sophia, my eldest grandchild. Unlike the brief acknowledgments she had sent to my photo updates, this message was substantive. "Grandmother, your photos have been extraordinary. Dr. Levinson in histology has traveled extensively in Alaska and remarked on how fortunate you were to capture certain geological formations in such perfect conditions. I've been thinking about our last conversation before you left, and about things Mom has said recently. I believe I owe you an apology for my part in taking your presence and support for granted. Medical school consumes my attention, but that's no excuse for failing to acknowledge how much your encouragement has meant throughout my education. Would it be possible to speak by video call sometime? There's something I'd like to discuss with you directly, rather than through family channels. With respect and love, Sophia." The formal tone was pure Sophia, always precise, always slightly reserved, but the content represented a significant departure from our usual communications. I found myself touched by her initiative and intrigued by her request. After a moment's consideration, I replied that I would be happy to speak with her upon my return from Alaska, suggesting a time the following week. Her response came quickly. "Thank you. I look forward to our conversation." That evening, I stood on my private veranda watching the sunset paint the Alaskan coastline in shades of gold and rose. A pod of orcas surfaced periodically in the distance, their distinctive dorsal fins silhouetted against the darkening water. The tranquility of the moment provided perfect conditions for reflection. Sophia's message suggested a crack in the family's united front, or perhaps more accurately, a sign that the next generation might navigate family relationships differently than their parents had. Of all my grandchildren, Sophia had always been the most reserved, the one who modeled her mother's clinical detachment and professional focus. For her to reach out independently, acknowledging entitlement and requesting direct communication, represented a meaningful shift. As I watched the last light fade from the horizon, I considered what this might signify for the larger family reconfiguration I had set in motion. The trust modifications wouldn't be finalized until after the family meeting scheduled for my return, which meant there was still space for evolution in my approach, not reversal, but perhaps refinement. My Alaskan journey had provided not just spectacular scenery and welcome independence, but also the perspective that comes with distance. Far from the familiar patterns and expectations of home, I could see more clearly which aspects of my response to my children's behavior arose from hurt, which from principle, and which from genuine concern for their character and development. Sent a brief message to Meredith that evening. May need to discuss certain adjustments to the trust amendments before finalizing. Will call upon my return. The slight revision to my plans didn't represent retreat from my core decision, but rather a recognition that transformation, for me and for my family, would be a journey of many steps rather than a single dramatic gesture. My return home from Alaska marked the beginning of a different journey, one through the altered landscape of family relationships I had deliberately reconfigured. The house felt both familiar and strange after my absence, like a well-worn garment that no longer quite fit. I moved through the rooms with new awareness, seeing not just the comfortable spaces I had inhabited for decades, but also the subtle accommodations I had made to others' preferences and expectations over the years. The anticipated video call with Sophia took place 3 days after my return. She appeared on my screen in her tiny apartment near the medical school, white coat hanging visible in the background, textbook stacked neatly on the desk beside her computer. "Grandmother," she began formally, then hesitated. "I'm not sure how to start this conversation. Perhaps with whatever prompted you to request it," I suggested gently. She nodded, gathering her thoughts with the same methodical precision she applied to her studies. "After you left on your trip, there was significant discussion about the trust changes you're planning. Mom and Dad and the uncles had multiple meetings. They consulted attorneys. This was no surprise, though hearing it confirmed by Sophia created a curious mix of disappointment and vindication." "And how do you feel about these discussions?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "Initially, I was angry at you," she admitted with characteristic directness. "The educational trust for medical school is essential to my plans. But then I learned that you specifically protected those funds for all the grandchildren." "Of course," I said. "Your education was never in question." She studied me through the screen, her expression thoughtful. "That made me start thinking about the larger pattern, about how you've always prioritized our development and opportunities, often without recognition. I began noticing how frequently your contributions, financial and otherwise, were taken for granted. The insight from someone so young surprised me." "That's quite perceptive, Sophia." "I'm observant," she said with a small shrug. "It's necessary in medicine." She paused before continuing. "I want you to know that regardless of what happens with the trust, I've spoken to my cousins, and we all agree that your birthday should have been honored. That the choices our parents made were wrong, even if they can't seem to acknowledge it." This intergenerational alliance was unexpected and deeply moving. "Thank you for telling me that." "There's more," she continued, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "I'd like to be involved with the Harold Woodridge Memorial Foundation, the one supporting rural healthcare access. It aligns perfectly with my interest in medically underserved communities." I felt a surge of emotion at this request. The foundation had been created to honor Harold's deeply held beliefs about healthcare accessibility, beliefs we had discussed often but rarely shared with the family. That Sophia would independently express interest in this aspect of her grandfather's legacy seemed almost miraculous. I would welcome your involvement, I told her, not bothering to hide how much her request meant to me. The foundation could benefit greatly from your perspective as a future physician. Our conversation continued, moving beyond the immediate family tensions to Sophia's studies, her developing interest in rural medicine, and the experiences I'd had in Alaska. By the time we concluded the call, something fundamental had shifted between us, a deeper connection based on shared values and mutual respect, rather than merely familial obligation. That evening, I made final adjustments to my plans for the upcoming family meeting, incorporating new insights from my Alaskan journey and my conversation with Sophia. The core principles remained unchanged, but I recognized the opportunity to build bridges even as I established necessary boundaries. The Eleanor Woodridge, who had departed on an Alaskan cruise, was returning not just with photographs and memories, but with renewed clarity about the legacy I truly wished to leave. One measured not in dollar amounts, but in values transmitted and character developed across generations. The day of the family meeting arrived with the kind of perfect summer weather that seemed designed specifically to soften difficult conversations. I had requested that Meredith arrange for us to gather at her firm's conference room rather than my home, a neutral territory that would help maintain the necessary formality while removing the emotional complications of family surroundings. Arrived early, settling into the chair at the head of the polished mahogany table that reminded me so much of the board meetings I had led throughout my career. Through the large windows, downtown bustled with ordinary Tuesday activity, people, moving purposefully through lives unaware of the small drama about to unfold in this quiet room. My children arrived separately but within minutes of each other. Richard first, then Elizabeth, finally Michael, each nodding stiffly in greeting. The tension in their postures suggested strategic discussions had continued until the last moment. What surprised me was the additional presence they hadn't mentioned. All three had brought their spouses, and to my greater astonishment, all 5 of my grandchildren filed in behind them, including Sophia, who gave me a subtle nod of encouragement. Meredith welcomed everyone with professional warmth before beginning her presentation of the trust modifications. As she outlined the details, the redirection of assets to the foundation, the new performance-based distribution structure, the enhanced educational provisions for future generations, I watched my children's faces. Their expressions cycled, through carefully controlled neutrality, to occasional flashes of dismay when particularly significant changes were explained. When Meredith concluded her presentation, silence hung heavy in the room. Richard, ever the spokesman, cleared his throat. "Before we respond to these modifications," he said carefully, "we, the 3 of us, would like to present something first." At his nod, Michael produced a large flat package wrapped in simple, blue paper. Elizabeth stood and took it from him, then walked around the table to place it before me. "This is long overdue," she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. With curious fingers, I unwrapped the package to reveal a handsomely framed photograph I had never seen before. It showed Harold and me on our 30th wedding anniversary, standing together in our garden. Harold's arm was around my shoulders, and we were both laughing at something off camera. What struck me most was how we were looking at each other, with unmistakable partnership and love. "We found this when going through Dad's old files," Richard explained. "It was taken by a colleague at your anniversary party, but never printed. The digital file was labeled The Perfect Team." I traced my fingers over Harold's face, remembering that day with sudden clarity. The garden in full bloom, friends gathered to celebrate, Harold proposing a toast to my wife, who makes everything possible. "We've been doing a lot of thinking since you left," Michael continued, his usual bravado subdued. "About what Dad would say about how we've been acting, about what you built together and what that should mean to us." Elizabeth stepped forward, her clinical detachment giving way to genuine emotion. "We were wrong, Mother. Not just about the birthday, but about taking you and everything you've done for us for granted. Richard gestured to the grandchildren. We've had some frank family discussions about values and gratitude, about the difference between expecting inheritance and earning legacy. Sophia moved to stand beside me, placing a hand gently on my shoulder. We asked to be here today, Grandmother, because we want to be part of rebuilding what's been damaged. I looked around at their faces, my children, their spouses, my grandchildren, and saw something I hadn't fully recognized during the painful confrontations of recent months. They were capable of growth, of recognition, of change, just as I had been at 80. The trust modifications will proceed as outlined, I said finally, my voice steady. Not as punishment, but as opportunity, to reclaim the values your father and I always intended our legacy to represent. I stood, still holding the framed photograph. But there's something else I'd like to propose today. Something not about money or distribution structures, but about time, the most precious resource any of us possess. And there, in that conference room filled with legal documents detailing millions in assets, I outlined a different kind of inheritance. Quarterly family retreats focused on service projects, monthly dinners with rotating hosting responsibilities, and regular one-on-one excursions between generations. A structure for meaningful connection that no trust document could enforce, but that would ultimately prove far more valuable than any financial provision. As we concluded the meeting and stepped into the summer sunshine, Richard asked the question I could see on all their faces. Will you cancel your upcoming travels now that we've reached this understanding? I smiled, tucking Harold's photograph carefully under my arm. Absolutely not. Australia awaits in September, New Zealand in October, but I've adjusted my itinerary to return for Thanksgiving. Michael looked puzzled. You're still leaving? Even after all this? Of course, I replied simply. The lesson was never that you should prioritize me above all else. It was that all of us, myself included, should recognize what truly matters before it's too late. As we parted ways on the sidewalk, I felt Harold's presence more strongly than I had in years. The perfect team, I whispered to the photograph I carried. Still working on our greatest project, even now. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.